What's up, everyone, and welcome back to In Search of Answers. This is the series where you all ask me questions, and I do my very best to answer them. Kind of clues in the name, I suppose. We actually got a ton of questions in for this episode, which is awesome. Thank you all so much. Please keep those coming, because that's where we want to be. We want to be at the point where there's always plenty of questions to get some time to talk about here on the show. If you would like to submit a question, all you got to do, leave a comment here on YouTube. I'll look through those and pick out some questions from there. Or if you are a subscriber over on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/devilor, check that out. And you can find the posting for this episode over there. Inside that posting will be a link to a form that you can fill out. And patrons who use that method to submit questions get priority on having their questions answered here on the show. So especially for weeks like this, where I had more questions than I could use, it's a nice little extra perk for patrons just to get that extra, boost towards making sure that your question gets answered. Cool. Let's actually get into our first question. This one comes from Shark over on Patreon, who says, WoW has become increasingly focused on the endgame over the years, and it feels like the individual journey of your character has been lost in the process. New players only get to experience one of the expansions before jumping right into current content, leaving out some major moments in the story of WoW. They go on to say, how could WoW approach this issue, allowing players to get a cohesive story if they choose, and is it a problem that's even worth solving? So I had to kind of trim this question down a little bit just to fit it like in that segment on the screen to just for here on the show. But some of the other stuff that Shark was mentioning in this question specifically is a comparison to a game like Final Fantasy XIV, where it's very almost episodic. It's all different chapters in the same story of your Warrior of Light as you're going through all the different expansions. And they actually force you on a new character to play through all of those different story beats and complete that entire story. In fact, they've even made changes over the years to Final Fantasy XIV to make some of the bits of the story that previously required a large group. They've made some changes to make it so that you can get into that content easier without having to do something like having to be as part of an organized raid group and stuff like that. Thinking specifically about like the tower at the end of A Realm Reborn as I talk about that. And it's really interesting to look at that comparison. And there was a video that Jesse Cox actually made a while back that I think his take on it and his summary of the differences between WoW and Final Fantasy XIV were really, it was really smart the way that he put it. He said essentially World of Warcraft is an MMORPG, whereas Final Fantasy XIV is an RPG MMO. And I highly recommend you go find that video and look it up if you want to see the comparison in more detail, because it was really, really insightful. But basically the idea and the core concept behind that is World of Warcraft is a game that is about the MMO gameplay first and foremost. It is about the large group content. It's about raiding. It's about dungeons and so on. It's very much focused on the player interaction with other players as its like primary gameplay hook. Whereas Final Fantasy XIV is more of an RPG that you're going to play through for the story that just happens to have an MMO attached to it. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into the content that is the group-based content in Final Fantasy XIV. I'm not trying to diminish that in any way, but it's very clearly a game where the story that they're telling you and the path that you're going through in a very like quintessential Final Fantasy sense is the focus. That's the primary thing that they're wanting you to experience in Final Fantasy XIV. So the comparison between those two it's really just two different games as far as I'm concerned. It's very different focus. It's similar to comparing something like God of War to something like League of Legends. Like there's a different focus on the gameplay experience that they're trying to provide and the player experience that they're trying to put together. Now, that said, I do agree with the underlying part of this question here, talking about how a lot of the story of WoW, like there is still story in WoW, and it's actually very difficult for a new player to experience any of that, really. Like, there's a lot of things that have occurred in the past, like the whole story of Wrath of the Lich King, the whole story of the Burning Crusade, and so on, the story of Cataclysm. If it weren't for things like Wrath of the Lich King Classic, like Cataclysm Classic, it would be basically almost impossible for any player to really get a sense of what all of that story was. And even then, so much of the story of World of Warcraft ends up then, like the conclusion to those stories ends up being things that happen in raids. So unless you're going back and doing like old raid finder runs by yourself, sometimes you literally can't see where the story ends up. You get to see a little bit of like the introduction to the story. You get to understand what's going on. You get presented with this crisis, and then you move on to the next expansion without having done anything about it. So it definitely gets very, very strange as you go through. But that's the part where I look at the second part of Shark's question here that they put right at the end, which is the question of, is it a problem that's even worth solving? And I think there's ways that it can be improved slightly, but I appreciate the notion of, because one of the biggest pitfalls that game developers can fall into is getting so focused on an issue, like recognizing that something is not ideal, recognizing that something could theoretically be improved, and focusing so hard on fixing the problem that they don't necessarily realize that their fix actually has overall made the experience worse for the player. That's something that happens all of the time, where in trying to resolve one issue, you do a bunch of crazy stuff that now, yes, technically that issue is now resolved, but now there's all this other crap that's going on that's actually making things worse. And I think for a game like World of Warcraft, where again, the focus is very much on the group content, it's very much on the dungeons, the raids, the battlegrounds, the arenas, and so on. Like that is the core of World of Warcraft gameplay, really, is those types of content. Yes, there's questing, yes, there's a story, yes, that's all going on, but that is not as much the like bread and butter of playing World of Warcraft as the group content tends to be. So it's an important thing that, yes, I think, sorry, my lights just decided to go crazy on me in the middle of this thought. Yes, it's the sort of thing that I think some improvements could be made on, but it would be important that it gets done in such a way that it's not then making a worse, like I don't think, for example, that World of Warcraft should go the route of something like Final Fantasy, where like just because the story hasn't been the primary focus in WoW for so long, it would not be good to once again require players to play every single expansion and complete the story quests in every single expansion. Like that would be a very poor experience for the new player coming to World of Warcraft in 2024 if you had to start all the way back with Classic and work your way through. Even logistics aside of like the world changes that happen in Cataclysm, like that would be super painful. The bad idea. Don't do that. So I think the idea is more, that's interesting. My power just went out. I'll be right back.
One eternity later.
Okay, we're back. That was certainly interesting. My power went out for a while, and then it came up, and then it went out again, and now it's back up, and it's been up for long enough that I'm hopefully, fingers crossed, we're done dealing with that. Fortunately, I have a battery backup attached to my computer, so that's why I was able to continue recording despite the fact that the power went out. That was super fun. Anyway, the point that I was sort of meandering in the direction of talking about more of a ability to experience the story in World of Warcraft, I think kind of the direction that I would like to see them go is more things like in a similar vein to things like Chromie Time. I don't think Chromie Time was quite the solution, just because that was something where like basically it was just an alternate way to level up characters, and it was intended more as a way for you to level up your alts in different ways and in different environments, and less of necessarily really being able to fully experience the story of those expansions. Which was like notably because you would get to like level, whatever the level cap was at the time, and then it would just kick you out. So that wasn't really the solution. I think it was level 50 when it first came out was the level cap. That wasn't really the solution, but something like that where you can experience, like you can intentionally say, hey, I want to go and experience this content and have some reason to go and do that, might be a good way to explore that a little bit more. I also think it would be good as they continue to explore ways and methods of storytelling in game to find more ways to spread that bits of story around more things than necessarily just the like end game raids and so on. Obviously the raids are important. They tend to be culminating moments of the storyline of an expansion because, it's a bunch of people grouping up to take on the big bad and take them down. So I'm not saying that they should pull the story out of the raids. It would just be cool to see more of it intermingled in different ways through different things. Like, for example, delves is a great example of a way that this could be done, where there could be a delve that occurs that has some important story element that occurs to it. I just had another thought and it just went away. Sorry, I'm still a little rattled from the whole power outage experience. I'm all over the place today. I do think it'll be interesting. This was a thought that I had. I do think it'll be interesting to watch how they approach this throughout the entirety of this War Within saga, because it does feel like this, at least the impression that they're giving off at the moment, is that this War Within, or sorry, the World Soul saga, with the War Within and then Midnight and then the Last Titan, is meant to be more of a Final Fantasy style cohesive story told across 3 acts sort of thing, than it has been in the past, where it was like, well, okay, there's Mists of Pandaria and there's a story of Mists of Pandaria, and it's pretty self-contained. There's like a tiny thread that then leads off into Warlords of Draenor, but it is just that tiny thread that leads off into Warlords of Draenor and so on. So I do think that we will, there's a lot of opportunity for them to experiment with different methods of storytelling coming through this upcoming World Soul saga, and it'll be very interesting to see how that goes. Yeah, hopefully that answers the question. Again, I do appreciate the thought of, is it a problem that's even worth solving? Because I think there's a lot of very heavy-handed ways that Blizzard could go through and try to like force this to become more of a thing if they wanted to. But I think there's a lot of very good reasons why that would be a bad idea. So it's better to find ways that work for World of Warcraft than necessarily going directly to something like Final Fantasy XIV and just copying what they did. Because the way that Final Fantasy XIV tells story would not work for World of Warcraft. Just flatly would not work. It would be require too much of a complete overhaul of how the game is played and what the focus of the game is for that to be something that could be done in World of Warcraft effectively. All right, I'm going to move on. The next question comes from Eben Knight on YouTube, who said, with the talk about RTS being playing the piano really fast, do you think better or more advanced AI for your own units would be helpful? Being more about commanding and, as you said, actual strategy rather than real-time micromanaging. So this is sort of in response to part of what we were talking about in the previous episode of In Search of Answers, where we were talking about David Kim's upcoming title that he's working on. It hasn't been announced fully yet, but David Kim, who is the former multiplayer lead for StarCraft 2, is now working at a company called Uncapped Games, and they're working on something. And he was talking in a recent interview about how they want to change up the RTS environment so that it's less about, as he put it, playing the piano really fast, like less about just stupid high APM movements constantly and telling each individual unit exactly what to be doing on a constant basis, and more about the overarching strategy and more the actual strategy of it. I like the term real-time strategy versus real-time micromanagement, because like the feel of being a general in a real-time strategy game kind of evaporates when you get down to the point of individually telling every single unit where to stand and what to shoot at and so on. Like, there should be some element, or at the very least, I would like to see a game in which there is some element of, yeah, you have your soldiers and they're going to do what they're going to do. And you kind of have to be like, okay, let's send these soldiers in this direction and hope that they get it right. Because that's kind of what being a general is, right? Like you're not as the general of an army, like walking out onto the battlefield, observing it from your helicopter up above and being like, you there, walk over there and shoot that guy. You there, do this thing over. Like, that's not how that works. And obviously in like a super futuristic setting like StarCraft, you can make an argument for that it could work that way. But it feels a bit weird. I would love to see a game, and maybe this game already exists and I'm just not aware of it, but I would love to see a game like maybe the Total War franchise does this. I'm actually not sure. I've never really been super into the Total War franchise. But the idea of you have some armies and you are more focused on the macro level, like what is the overarching troop movements? I'm going to tell these guys to go over there and take out that thing. And then how they approach that and what they do with that is then, once I've given that order, that's up to them. They will figure out how to do that. And I think as AI is becoming more advanced just in general, not generative AI, I just mean like the way that video game artificial intelligence for units has become more and more advanced over the years, I think we're approaching a point where something like that would totally be possible. Like in my head, I'm now imagining a real-time strategy game that almost has a kind of like an XCOM, where as you use a unit more and more, or as you use one of your soldiers more and more, they like level up and they become stronger and more experienced and so on, to the point where you eventually kind of have your dream team of like, yes, this is my best guy and he's super good at shooting or whatever. And then if you lose that guy, then you're like, oh man, that sucks. That was my best guy. Now I'm out this really, really powerful character that I previously had. I would actually kind of love to see a real-time strategy game where maybe you have like lieutenants, maybe you have like micro commanders, And the micromanagement is ultimately up to these AI units where you tell this person like, hey, or your unit is your commander. You issue orders to that commander. That commander then takes the units that you give them and tries to go and accomplish the task with the units that you gave them. So you might say, okay, we need to take out this bunker over here. I'm going to give you a bunch of grenadiers and a couple rocket launchers and a couple riflemen, and go and just do that. And you're not then going over there and individually telling the grenadiers to attack the bunker while the riflemen are shooting the people that are trying to like defend it and so on. You're literally like trusting this commander to make the sensible decisions when they get over there. Which then in turn means that the commanders could be, you could end up having a commander that you're like, yeah, that dude is great. This commander that I have is awesome. So I can give them fewer units and they'll get the job done, sort of stuff. I imagine an RTS like that could be really, really fun and engaging and interesting, and in a way that still adds a lot of gameplay without that gameplay necessarily being just constantly micromanaging your entire army by yourself. I love the idea of like real-time delegation, almost like picking different AI units that, based on what they've done previously, based on how they've acted before, based on their experience, based on their training, whatever it is, you then say, I know that this commander will need these units to accomplish this task. So I'm going to give this commander those units and send them off. And then a different one might have different requirements and so on. So I would love to see stuff like that. I don't know if that's what David Kim specifically is working on at Uncapped Games, but I would love to see something like that or more games in that vein for the RTS franchise or the RTS genre, as opposed to games that are like, we have Stormgate on the way. We're already eating pretty good when it comes to the playing piano really fast style of RTS. I would love to see other games, instead of just also trying to be Stormgate or also trying to be StarCraft. I would like to see other games start to explore that, the more strategy, the more macro level strategy aspect of the genre a bit more. I think that'd be super cool. All right, next question. This one comes from Gimli8347 on YouTube, who says, do you think WoW classes became too complex? So I don't think there's really an easy yes or no answer to this. Like, there's definitely WoW classes that I think are overcomplicated. There's definitely WoW classes that I think are complex but fine. And it's also important to understand the difference between complexity and complication. Complexity is something like you can have classes that have 3 buttons and they are deeply complex because of the different interactions that those buttons have and the way that you might use them in certain situations and so on. You could have an incredibly deep and complex, like demon hunters in some cases have been super, super deep and complex in certain way, like in their own way. With like, there's periods of time where they like literally had like 4 buttons that they were using. They were just using them in different ways and motion became part of it and so on. So it's super possible to have complicated without complex, and it's super possible to have complex without complicated. I think I would say some WoW classes have become too complicated. I'm not as worried about the complexity side of things. That does occasionally become the case, but more often than not, Blizzard has been pretty good about allowing you ways to opt out of overly complex rotations and so on. Obviously, some classes or some specs like Feral Druid, like Affliction Warlock, Shadow Priest, like the ones that are really about maintaining a lot of buffs and debuffs and so on, those can get to the point where you're just spinning so many different plates constantly that it feels overly complicated and not really like there's a point where that doesn't become, it's not complex. You're literally just trying to keep all these plates spinning. It's just annoying to try to do that. Whereas again, there can be classes like Windwalker Monk is one that I really like. I really like the depth and complexity to the Windwalker Monk rotation. I like that there's like a minimum of like 6 or 7 buttons that you're using as part of your main DPS rotation. I enjoy that about Windwalker Monk. My biggest complaint about Windwalker in Dragonflight, which they've done a lot of work towards correcting in the War Within, is just the complicated nature of it. There's just so many buttons. Like you start to run out of action bar space just trying to fit all of your main rotational things on your action bars. And then you don't have any space left over for random things like, do you want to put your Hearthstone on your action bar? Do you want to put whatever your food that you're going to eat on your action bar? When you start having to bump things like that off of your action bars because you have too many abilities, that's a problem. And so Windwalker was one that really I felt got overcomplicated. I enjoyed the complexity of Windwalker. I didn't like that there were just so many buttons involved into it. So I do think some have become that degree for sure. And I also find like some of the classes, especially some of the more recent ones, like Evoker, which I've been learning a bit more about how to play recently, and so on. As they've been adding more different ways for abilities to work, more different ways for abilities to interact with each other, and so on. Um, this is something that they kind of have to do to be able to create new and interesting things. But the idea of creating a new and interesting thing, like the empower mechanic for evoker abilities, for example. And there's also like the earth and racial actually is an empower ability in the War Within. These are things that, yes, they add some more depth, they add some more complexity, they add more ways that these abilities can work. But they also add more complication to it as well, in that this is now just an extra thing that you have to learn and you have to understand how it works. I think for me, where I really like things to land is the point where you can understand what's going on. You can understand the basic of how abilities work relatively easily. You can understand the basics of your rotation relatively easily. But then the way that they start to interact with each other, the way that different abilities interplay off of each other, the way that cooldowns line up for even like short term rotational abilities and so on, that you can start to get some complexity with. It's not adding more complication. It's not making it difficult to play the class just because you have to remember 47 different things all the time. But it's more optimization at that point, figuring out how to operate your rotation, operate your abilities to the most efficient manner by using them in this certain order, or again, in the case of Windwalker Monk, figuring out how best to alternate between your abilities, which then changes the priority for which abilities are most important based on things like chi generation and energy regen and stuff like that. So um, I do think definitely there have been points in the game's history where they've been too complicated, and sometimes too complex. But again, most of the time when there's like there are other options. Like I think it's okay for there to be some specs that are just massively complex. Um, it becomes a problem when they become overly complicated. So hopefully that kind of makes some sense. I know I feel a little bit like it's maybe a semantics argument between complex and complicated. And I think to the point of Gimli's question, what I'm trying to say is, yes, I think they've become too complicated. I just wanted to make sure to put in that distinction. At least in some cases, they become too complicated. I just wanted to make sure to put in that distinction between what I consider complexity and complication, just because I think it's still important to have a lot of depth to a class. I just don't think you need 50 different buttons that you're using on every single fight for that to occur. So, cool. I'm going to move on. Last question for today comes from Spa Monkey on YouTube, who said, do you have any plans to have another show like Legendary in the past, bouncing current WoW topics with some co-hosts in a podcast style? So this is a question that I get a lot, which always makes me happy to see, because it means that there's obviously a lot of fond memories around shows like Legendary in the past. And like I have a lot of fond memories about Legendary as well. I have a lot of fond memories of producing that show and co-hosting it and so on. So it makes me feel happy to see that people would like to see something like that again. I will say at the moment, I don't really have anything in the works along these lines, but it's absolutely something that I would love to do again. I would love to get a panel of hosts together on a, like, I don't know, weekly, semi-weekly, every couple of weeks, I don't know, some sort of regular basis to just sort of shoot the breeze with each other about gaming topics. I don't know that I would want it to necessarily be like specific to just WoW. It'd probably be more like, well, like this show, which is technically open to all topics, but obviously ends up talking about WoW a lot because that's something that's of interest. Like it's an audience-driven show, and the audience is into WoW, so we end up with a lot of WoW questions as a result. But technically, In Search of Answers is open to any question or any topics that just are gaming or even tech related in some capacity. But that said, no, I would absolutely love to do a show like Legendary. It's also worth noting, like that show is a lot of work to put together. You might think at first blush that like, oh, all you do is just talk about whatever happened in a given week, and then you just sit there and talk about it. But there's actually a ton of work that goes into preparing for a show like that. Just finding topics a lot of weeks can be very, very difficult when you're trying to fill like Legendary was an hour-long show on most cases. Trying to fill an hour-long show on a week where nothing happened is very difficult. And so sometimes you're just grasping at straws or looking for weird rumors or anything else along those lines. Sometimes it's like there's a lot of work that goes into like pre-scripting in some ways, because oftentimes when you're doing a live show like that, you do at least need to have some form of structure for how you're going to flow through it. And in some cases, like a lot of people don't necessarily realize this, but most of what Gary said on Legendary back in the day was something that I wrote, or after I left, it was Olivia that took over for me in terms of putting the show together after I left Legendary. And so that most of what Gary wrote after I left, Olivia wrote, or what Gary said, Olivia wrote, because we put together like a script that was like, here, Gary, at this point, say this thing, so that he could then be paying attention to things like managing the stream, switching between different cameras and so on. And it's hard to be focusing on switching cameras and making sure that what's going out on the stream is correct. And, you know, pulling up B-roll, playing footage, playing videos over top of what's being talked about. It's very difficult to focus on that while also being present and engaged in a conversation. So we usually just ended up giving Gary a few random questions to ask, and he would of course still contribute in his own ways. But most of the time when he was like, oh, so what do you think of this thing? Is it like this? Is this what people are talking about here? Is this what's going on? Yeah, that was something we scripted that in advance. Um, anyway, no, I would love to do something like that again. I did briefly for a while. I was doing a podcast with Mike B a while back. Started off with one called Don't Get Your Hopes Up, which was audio only. And then eventually we started doing a sort of legendary-ish panel show called Internet Famous. That unfortunately only lasted a couple months because, again, it was a ton of work to keep that going. And we also quite ambitiously set out the idea of we were going to have a different co-host, like a guest co-host for every single episode. And getting like lining up guest co-hosts on a constant basis is actually very hard. So that ended up being kind of a bad idea. But at any rate, it's absolutely something I'd love to do again. Obviously, I love talking. So that's why I do all these shows, is because I just love, I have thoughts and opinions constantly, and I just love talking. So I would love to be able to shoot the breeze with some other co-hosts on stuff like that. Totally be down to do it. Just don't have anything in the works right now along those lines. I do kind of have a lot going on at the moment. So I don't really have the ability to dedicate the extra time to putting something like that, like building that myself. I don't have time to do right now. So yeah. Anyway, hope that answers all those questions. Thank you all so much for watching, and thank you to everyone who sent in a question today. Again, if you would like to submit a question to be answered here on the show, two ways to do that. Easiest one, if you're on YouTube, just put a question down in the comments below. Whatever comes to mind. Like I said earlier, like the show is open to any gaming or even tech related content, or any gaming or tech related questions. It doesn't have to be World of Warcraft. Obviously, we get a lot of World of Warcraft questions because that's kind of what's been going on over here. That's not a problem. Like WoW questions are still completely and totally fine. But if you want to ask me my opinion on, I don't know, which Final Fantasy game was the best one, happy to talk about that. It was 9, by the way. Final Fantasy 9 was the best one. I know some people are going to be very angry about that opinion. The other way to submit a question, if you are a patron, you head over to patreon.com/Devilor. If you subscribe over there and you check the listing for this episode, inside that listing, you will find a link to a form that you can fill out to submit a question. And filling out that form and submitting your question through Patreon means that you'll get priority on further, what am I trying to say? You'll get priority on having that question answered here on the show. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I'm going to get out of here. I'll see you later.